morning. We have a group here from town who will identify themselves and who remember train history. I understand that we had 123 years of train history. So we're not going to recount 123 years, but we have some very special recollections. So starting,
Grace Marciano.
and what are your roots in Topsfield?
Well, I was born here in 1927. House I live in, never left. And I do remember all the trains and hearing that wonderful train whistle when it was coming through town and many other things. We'll wait for you to ask more questions though, Joan.
All right, and Dave, would you?
My name is Dave Gary. I was born in Topsfield. Now I live 1 mile from the border, so I haven't moved very far. I was raised here. My mother was raised here. My grandmother was raised here, born here. And I was a graduate of Topsfield High School in 1934. And I lived here just after World War II. I moved to Ipswich.
All right, and we've had Ken Crocker, who has given us a wonderful accounting of moving the train station. Are you also born in Topsfield?
Born and raised in Topsfield, and my mother and Dave were contemporaries, and she went to the old Topsfield High School and was one of the last classes, I think, that graduated in the old academy. She was an Topsfield Academy graduate, and she has some many wonderful stories about going to school there. And she grew up right on Main Street here in Topsfield.
And I'm Joan Canella, and I've lived here since 1961. And I'm sorry I'm not a town. And it doesn't matter. Well, I tried hard, but I don't think they're going to take me in. But nevertheless, I think that just keeping history alive and recording some of these memories gives us a lot of, I really remember rather vividly how quickly history has lost. So I thank you for coming, because really it will make this history come alive to people who want. So go ahead, you two were having a wonderful conversation with each other right here, you, Ken, and Dave Gary.
If you want to talk about railroads, I think one of the first things to think about Topsfield was really that we got left out in terms of any kind of transportation out of Topsfield. Most of the towns around, as I think Ken has only mentioned earlier, they had streetcars. Like Ipswich had streetcars, Essex had streetcars. All the towns around about had streetcars available if you wanted to get out of town. But you realize that in the 1920s, about the only automobiles available were those who had a lot of money and had 8 Model T Fords. And it wasn't until the 30s, really, that the automobile, people had enough money to, well, it was during the Depression, but they were, who had the money could buy automobiles. And I know in my family, I got my old 1929 second-hand Ford in 1936. So if you want to leave Topsfield, you pretty much have to go by railroad. And when I was a kid, there were 2 trains in the morning going out to Boston and 2 in the evening coming back from Boston. And they'd bring the mail in. And one of the social events of Topsfield, my job, my family used to be to go down and get the mail every evening. So the mail in those days was in the old Grange Hall, which burned shortly thereafter. And I can recall going down and sort of a social event began in front of the in the post office in the Grange Hall, and people were chatting and went there every evening. So wait till the mail got sorted out and was delivered.
And I might add that my brother, who was operating the business my father had left him when he died in 1930, had a great big wheelbarrow. And he went down, every time the train came in, down he went with wheelbarrow, picked up the mail, and took it next door to the Grange Hall post office, whatever. So we used to see him out there with his cart wheeling it down through. Mail always went through.
Did you take the trains? Did you use the trains at all, Grace?
Yes, I did not as much because I lived in town, worked in town, but you knew when you needed to go to Boston, you just got on that train and went. But the ideal thing about it, when I was a freshman in high school, I needed some dental work. I had a bad injury, and I had, infections and all that kind of stuff. So, getting out of Topsfield was not easy. And somebody in the family who was working. And I used to have to leave school. Somebody would give me a ride to Salem, because he worked at the Peacock House. Then I learned to take either the bus or the train to Danvers. In either case, either the train station in in Salem, or the bus, when they got the big bus terminal. In either case, then to Danvers and then the train home. And believe you me, that gave me a lot of independence for a freshman in high school. But then anytime we wanted to go to Boston, we could get on that train. And can remember the time we went in, a group of us. It was so exciting because we're going to take the boat to Provincetown. But that train was always there when you needed it. You could sit back and enjoy it.
How long a train ride was that?
Gee, I don't recall.
I want to ride to Boston, it's about an hour, as I remember.
Stopped everywhere.
But the thing is that the big shopping center for the people of Topsfield was Salem. There were no shopping centers, no malls. So if you wanted to do any serious shopping, you had to go to Salem. Now to get to Salem, you take the morning train out of Topsfield to Danvers. And there was a junction at Danvers. And there was another train route that ran from Salem through Danvers, up through West Peabody, and maybe up to Lawrence, I don't recall. So we had to change to get on that train to get to Salem. And I can remember that in 1932 I fractured my nose badly, and my mother had me down to the doctor, and we had to go down in the morning and wait around to see the doctor, and then she took me to the movies in the afternoon, so we could take the evening train back to Topsfield. But it was it.
Gracie,
So, yeah.
Gracie, didn't I take the train to Boston
Yes,
every
my
day?
sister went to school in Boston, and so did many others. And that train, she commuted by train to Boston. And I can remember her telling that Professor Roberts from Oxford, who taught English, I think, at BU, he and his friends taught the girls to play bridge. So they ended up, after those trips, learning to play bridge. I don't know how well. And my sister always talks about the time. She had a lot of time after classes to wait for the train. So she got very familiar with Boston, walked all over the place, the gardens and the Common and down to the North End, everything. It was just a great experience having it there because you knew when it was time you could go to North Station and get on that train and come home.
Did you have recollections of the trains, the actual trains in there?
Well, I grew up on Summer Street. So Summer Street was right adjacent to the railroad tracks where the second depot was. And vaguely recall my mother telling me that the last passenger train that left Topsfield was early in the 50s. And I was a passenger on that train, and I think that she kept everything, so I think the ticket is probably still around. But what I remember about the train was it was a period back in the 50s when a lot of the houses in Topsfield were heated by coal. So the train provided the means to get the coal to Topsfield. And right adjacent to Summer Street was the Woodbury Fuel Company coal yard. And that's all gone now, and there's actually a dwelling there. But that coal yard was just old, big wood buildings and massive piles of bituminous and anthracite coal. And it was a lot of fun to play there, though I remember my mother wasn't too happy with what you looked like when you got home. But the train would come, drop off the coal. My father actually worked down there for a while for Woodbury Fuel Company. And the last recollection I have of the train was when it was bringing carloads of things for the Essex County Co-op. And the co-op they used the old depot freight station adjacent to Main Street to store things. And we used to wait for the train to come and then go down to the tracks and put pennies on the track. And the train would flatten the pennies, and when they left, we'd have these flat pennies that we thought were quite something. That's my train recollection.
Well, we didn't waste money. We used nails.
Well, speaking of that train station, of course, the freight came in. I don't know how frequently. My nephew couldn't be here today, but when he was 4 or 5, that kid would, he lived on Central Street, get out of bed on Sunday mornings, go down to the to Park Street, and the engineers all knew him. And that little 4-year-old, 5-year-old kid got many a ride on the engine on Sundays, you know, and to this day, he's a train buff. He's up in Montreal at the moment, thrilled to pieces seeing all the trains that go through the city. But another recollection was the excitement in July when the rodeo came to town. And I can't remember if they had extra cars for the personnel or what. I don't remember that part of it. But all the people, all those good-looking cowgirls and cowboys, you know, would get off the train, and we knew that there was going to be a lot of fun down at the fairground. And then eventually they brought the cattle and the horses in to the old station there, whatever it was. And it was so exciting because we'd go down and watch, and they'd be leading the cattle down or loading them onto trucks and walking the horses down to the fairgrounds. Then when the rodeo ended, you know, being summer with the windows open, they had left town, but you could hear the clippity-clop of the horses on the way back to be left off. It was kind of a sad, poignant moment, you know. The fun had ended, but we look forward to that every single year. It was just great.
Does anyone remember, where is Price's Hill? The water.
Price's Hill?
Yes.
It's Price's Hill.
No, I mean, is that,
It's on Prospect Street, I think you call it.
oh,
You go across the, you go down South Main Street where you turn left, where it goes left,
yes?
that hill is Prospect Street, isn't it? That's Price's Hill.
How
Price's
come
used to
it
live
was
on
called
top.
Price's Hill?
Beg pardon?
How come it was called
Because
Price's
the
Hill?
Price family lived up there.
But,
In the
Yeah,
old
they,
days. The
did
old
they
days.
live in the house, the first house there, was that the Price house, you know, down, that sets way down and back? Or did they? Then just
Well,
beyond
they lived
that,
up near the top of the hill there.
then beyond that, way down and back, one of the Price ladies married Mr. Northey, and she lived down and back, and then there was a house nearer the road where her 2 maiden lady sisters lived. And so, you know, that's how that came about. You want to know about Price Hill, I think. Was there some connection?
well, I just wondered that somebody mentioned the water tank on Price's Hill, and I didn't really know where Price's Hill was, because I don't hear any reference to it now. Also, they had the water supply for the trains, there was some kind
Oh,
of,
that's right, yeah, I don't know what that was.
I don't know how they worked that.
It wasn't another building with a tank to fill up the train with water, but I think it was further down toward Route 1.
Oh, okay.
And you know, down there where the tracks met Main Street, there was this gadget for switching the tracks. Remember that one?
Mhm.
Kenny used to be fascinated with that. We'd play with that. If we'd ever get it to work, we could raise, you know, created some havoc. But, you know, it was just a fascinating contraption. One other incident that my sister remembers, many people in town knew Curtis and Eunice Campbell, and they had 2 little boys. And Curtis worked in Boston. So in the morning, Eunice would drive Curtis and the little boys down to the train. The boys would get on the train with their father. Then she would race down to Tableyville. Or is it Putnamville? Putnamville, I guess it is, the first stop. And the little boys would get off the train, and their mother would take them home, and they'd have their little train ride every morning.
Well, I do thank you for.
Well, the locomotives were, you could gather from the discussion, they were steam locomotives.
Yeah.
Where they weren't diesel-powered
Sure.
trains, they were all steel-powered.
Yeah.
And then right after the steam-powered, then right after the war, when the passenger service stopped, my recollection was that they had these, the co-op used to have these storage buildings up just to the west of Main Street. And so the train still came in occasionally, delivering grain for the co-op after the passenger
That's
service
right.
stopped. So I was a kid on High Street, I remember waking up in the morning, everyone lives, you heard the old
Yes, right.
old train, steam engine pumping water out.
And then invariably, the conductor would go into the telephone office, which was there on the corner of Park Street, and ask them to call the Chotes, the Choate Farm Danvers, because the cattle were on the tracks again. Somebody mentioned yesterday cattle getting on the tracks. They own them, let's face it, it was their land.
Well, that's, you know, wonderful recollections that I don't think unless you were willing to come today, and I certainly appreciate it, we could have kept it or would have, we would simply be lost. So I do thank you very much. Appreciate it. And I think it adds a lot.
Hi, I'm Dick Sims. I did the talk over here at the library when they had the rail trail opening. Joan asked some wonderful questions, but I, looking at it from the railroad perspective, had a couple of other ones I'd like to ask you.
In those days, the Boston Symphony had youth concerts during the week. And we would go to Hamilton to take the train to Boston.
Oh, yes.
To get to Symphony Hall, then by subway there. So that would have been probably after that period of time. And I'm sure, so there was that other train that's still going from Hamilton.
And you had more choice of trains because there was a lot more going through Hamilton.
And I'm sure you have the same crew of conductors that, were on the train.
Yeah,
they know all their passengers.
Yeah, usually they all knew everyone by name.
That's it. And I can remember the time I was reading a book, I think it was The Three Musketeers or something. And I remember the conductor being very familiar with all of the series, and telling me to read them all because you got a great history of France.
Sure.
And in those days, so I thought, I did, with his encouragement. So I thought, these guys weren't just ticket collectors.
Right. Do you remember who the station agent was at Topsfield?
I don't.
I
It was a building. Occasionally it was open. Was it all? I don't know.
I don't remember any
It
myself.
seemed to be occasionally being in there, and there was always that musty, or not exactly musty, but there was that smell that seemed to permeate railroad stations, and I think he had a wood stove as well. But other than that, I don't even know who was there. They did have, I don't know if they did at this station, their telegraph.
Yes. West of Union.
Yeah, and clicking away. That's sort of like a long lost memory.
Each station had its own call sign. And they told me the agent could actually be nodding off and asleep, and all the other stuff, the traffic would go by and he wouldn't know. But if it came to that call sign for that station, they'd immediately wake up because they could hear it. Yeah, those clicks would be just in a certain order, and they'd immediately come to and say, oh yeah, this is for us. Yeah. Do you know when the station was done away with? Did it burn? What happened to it?
Did they tear it down? Do you know, Kenny? I remember it was there, then it wasn't. I have a feeling that it got torn down. I don't remember.
I heard it got torn down.
Yeah.
1938.
So we took the train without a station.
And then, they built that silly little lean-to, which
Oh,
is
yes.
the picture over there, which seems to be what happened to most of them. Yeah. Nothing else you can remember about that area?
Not that, no.
All right, thank you. Very much.
My name is Ken Crocker. I'm a longtime Topsfield resident and graduate of the elementary school in Mascanoma, so I'd always been around town, and I'd always seen what turned out to be the old depot, though at the time when I was younger I didn't know it. But about 1988, there were a couple of developers in Topsfield, and they wanted to put up a commercial building, and so what had been the old train depot was going to be taken down. And being a member of the Historical Society and on the Historic District Commission, I was trying to prevent that. And so my wife and I worked on the project, and we actually had a lot that my parents had bought years before, and we were able to take a trailer, which nobody seemed to want in Topsfield anymore, get the trailer out of there, move the old depot down, and remodel it. So that happened in 1988, and just to go over it, what happened was the depot was the original 1854 train station, and it was built on Main Street, and it was utilized for almost 50 years. And then a fellow named Otto Lake bought the place, and he was a long-time Topsfield resident as well. He moved it across the street, and he remodeled it into a dwelling. And that dwelling was used up until the late 80s, when we got involved with the project in 1988. So what we did was acquire the property from the developers. They just wanted it moved, and we got it, and we had it brought down to Summer Street, had a foundation ready for it, and moved it into position. It cost about $12,000 to move the building. and then we spent obviously more money to get it renovated, and then we rented it for quite a few years, and it's a cute little house. But you can see where it was out behind the old Elliott Fuel, and there was a gas station next to it, and this is where Otto Lake had put the building to use as a dwelling. And then we were able to get it jacked up, bring it out, and go down Park Street. You can see it coming around the corner of Park Street. And then we brought it down and we weren't allowed to cut any tree limbs. The town didn't want any tree limbs cut down. And so we were able to get a couple guys up on the roof pushing limbs up as we came under. And an interesting point was the power company, the phone company, and the cable company were very helpful in moving lines either up or down to move the building. And what I never did quite understand this, but I think if you have a public way, that public way extends all the way up to the moon, and you can't block it. So if the power company has lines across and you need to use that public way like we did for a legitimate purpose, they had to move the lines. So some were moved up, some were moved down, and we got the building down onto Summer Street and back into position. And then the house became 16 Summer right here. We ended up keeping it for a number of years and eventually sold it, but it's a cute little place. Now, the interesting story about this, a fellow named Steve Nutter was doing work for me, and Steve ultimately ended up renting the house for quite a few years. But I said to Steve one day, I was a pilot and I was going to work, and I went down to check on the progress of the job, and I said, Steve, we need to find something, like an old train ticket or anything that would show that the place was in fact a train depot, even though we know it was. We haven't really discovered anything. So I went on a 3-day trip, and I came back, and I came in and I said, Steve, how's the project going? We're building a dormer. And he said, Ken, you're going to really be excited. I did find something. And so he said, turn around and look. And here was this Topsfield train sign. And what appears to have happened is Otto Lake, I think he was historically minded, and Otto, when the house was ready to be a dwelling, there was no access up into the attic. It had been lathed over, plastered. But at the last moment, somebody took that sign. It may have been hanging, and they took it down, and Otto scribbled notes on the sign, and he made it, in effect, a time capsule. So what he did is he said, the old depot was decommissioned in 1898, and then in 1901, he mentions who moved the building. A fellow from Boxer, I think, moved it, and then it was remodeled, roof cut down, remodeled into a house. And he wrote these notes, and then the last note he wrote was, Valley Road is being graded for electric cars. And that never happened. Valley Road was cut in, but electric cars never came up from Danvers to Topsfield. So then he took the sign, put it up into the overhead, and it was plastered in. And that would have been about 1901, and then we found the sign in 1988. So it was really a treasure, and now we still have the sign, and eventually I think it'll probably go to the Historical Society here, but we're still enjoying it. So that's my story with the depot.
Hi, I'm Richard Sims, formerly with the Walker Transportation Collection at the Beverly Historical Society, and I helped to put together some of the railroad history in Topsfield for the opening of the rail trail in October of 2009. And in connection with that, I did a short talk at the library, and we covered a lot of pictures, which you'll see here on these poster boards behind me. And just for the fun of it, let's go over some of these and point out some of the interesting features of them. Starting with this one here at the top, that's a picture that has existed for years of the original 1854 depot at Topsfield. One of the very few pictures, only two that I know of, were ever taken of that building. And unfortunately, it's a very poor one, but it does show a train in the station, and that's about 1872. And try as we might, we've tried to locate other pictures from that era, but we have not been successful yet. Because of that, I took it upon myself to do a drawing based on that same scene, just for my own interest of seeing what the thing would look like if you had a good image of it. So we don't know whether it's good or not, but that's what resulted from it. The other pictures on that panel basically are all from the diesel era. The one up here is a kind of a rare picture. It shows a Boston and Maine GP-18 type locomotive, which we only had 5 of those. And I don't know how often they came up here, but that's the only time I ever saw one come up the branch. And that was in 1968, and it's crossing Route 97 at the second crossing just beyond the Ipswich River. The two pictures here show a GP9 type locomotive on the twice or three times weekly freight to Topsfield from Danvers. Those two pictures were taken by the late Dana Story, who was the unofficial historian of Essex, Massachusetts. And again, show the weekly comings and goings of basically the freight cars that went to the co-op, because they were the essential customer up here at the end. This picture, this, and this all feature a special excursion train that came to Topsfield in April of 1969. It was 4 Bud rail diesel cars which came from Boston and during the day covered all the branch lines in eastern Massachusetts. It was a full-day event, and I actually rode it. It was a really fun trip, and was the last actual passenger train that actually came to Topsfield, although it certainly wasn't a scheduled train, because those ended shortly before World War II, 1941. This last picture on this panel, even though you really can't see it, there's a freight train coming across Route 97 as viewed from the highway bridge over the Ipswich River looking north along Route 97. Turning to this panel on the right, we have a nice cross-section of views here, starting with, up at the top, a picture that was really posed so that Mr. Albert Hale, who was the photographer, could actually take the picture of the freight train coming down from Newburyport in 1938, stopped at the station on Park Street. And it's just a delightful picture, and it's made more delightful by the fact you have 2 little kids hiding in the bushes here looking at the train. And you can also, in the background, just make out the freight house beyond South Main Street. And in a closer view, there is one of the 2 freight houses that were up there, one of which is now a barn, and the other one, I believe, has been taken down and stored somewhere. So they both still exist. Coming down this side, we have the second station, which was located on Park Street. We have 3 views of that right here. Again, we're looking north in this view, south in this view, and north in this view. We have a train stopped here. And as we come down, again, we're looking at Route 97. Just before you go up the big hill, this is actually in Wenham, I believe. And we have a GP7 type diesel locomotive crossing the highway, and I actually took that from the side window of my car. It came up on me real quickly. I had the camera, leaned out the window, and just took the shot. And that was back in 1964. Again, we have a local freight here in color crossing the Ipswich River. That bridge is still very visible today and is now a prominent part of the rail trail. We have a GP9 type locomotive crossing South Main Street, switching out the siding in front of the freight house. And down here, again, a little bit of a rarity here, we have an Alco RS3 type locomotive, and that's crossing Route 1 southbound with the freight. Here we have a GP9 locomotive, again at the same exact spot. These 2 pictures were taken almost from the very same vantage point. Here we have right downtown, right adjacent to where the station would have been on Park Street, again another Alco road switcher. Didn't see that up here too often. Usually they were General Motors locomotives, but this was made by the American Locomotive Company. And again, a close-up picture of that same type of engine. So we're kind of happy that we got that, and also that it was in color. And last but not least, we have a picture taken from the back door of the caboose on one of these freights that we actually rode, and that's taken down around Putnamville, and gives a good image of what the conductor on the freight train might have seen as the train wandered along through the pucker brush. So there you have it, folks. We have a nice montage here of a lot of views of the railroad. Here you see a list of all the station stops that you could get off at on this backcountry route from Newburyport down to Boston. Okay, now we have another panel here which has some very interesting views. I think perhaps one of the most interesting involves the original station, which we just mentioned, the one from 1854, and here it is And as you can see, this is, again, not a very good picture like the other one. It's very poor, but at least we have the image of the station where it was. And what's fascinating about this is the station was actually moved not once, but twice. First, it was moved over into the center of town, and it stayed there for many, many years, and then it was finally moved again over to Summer Street, and again, it doesn't look much like the original building, but that's because when they first moved it to make it into a house, they removed the entire upper part of the building, which you can see has quite a shallow pitch to it, and increased the pitch so that you could have living space upstairs. So that's why as you look at the end of this, you say, my goodness, that doesn't really look like this at all. But that's because this was raised up, so it makes the rest of the building look a little bit narrower. But in any event, that's the original 1854 depot. It's now at 16 Summer Street, and looks just great. The other really interesting image that we haven't talked about on this panel is this one right here. And again, this is an Albert Hale photograph from the Beverly Historical Society's Walker collection, and it shows a northbound train, which is unusual because we really don't have any other pictures of something coming north out of Topsfield. It's just approaching the Washington Street crossing, and fortunately, Al Hale wrote on the back of the picture the train number. So we have a train number to go by, and we have a date, because he was very careful in recording the date. So we went to a timetable from that date. We looked up the train number, found out that this was a Saturday-only train, which ran from Boston to Newburyport. And we found out when it left Boston, which I believe was 12:22 in the afternoon, arrived at Topsfield at about an hour later, and at 1:58, it arrived at Newburyport. So we know that it's the train number such and such, we know the date, we know what time it is in midday, because even the shadow matches here, the sun's coming from here. And so we have a beautiful little time capsule in that picture, all because the photographer recorded that information for us. What's really fun to look at today is to compare this view with the present view of the rail trail. And Joan Panella has wonderfully clipped an image of the locomotive from the entire background, pasted it onto the current rail trail picture. So now we have this wonderful montage of this same train coming right down this particular spot. And if it weren't for all these trees, you can actually see the hill behind the school in the background, which is still there. If you could see through the trees, it's right in here. When we're looking south, Washington Street is right behind us. So you have this wonderful collation of images from like 65 years distant. Just wonderful. And lastly, a picture here shows the passenger train at the third, don't blink and you'll miss this, the third station in Topsfield, which was nothing more than a little crude lean-to. And it was just enough to shelter a half a dozen people, which probably were all the people that were riding the train by the time this was taken in 1946. And service ended shortly after that, and then you had to make it down to Danvers if you wanted to take the train to Boston after that period. So a lot of history right here on this panel, and I think some of it's really fascinating.
I've been asked to say a few words about the railroad marker that we've just finished setting up at the corner of Park Street and South Main Street. And as background, I'd like to mention that the Historical Society has put up 5 other markers around the town that at some point might be deserving of its own trail. One of these is right at the entrance to the Posse Capeman House, not far from where we are at the moment. Another one is at the entrance to the Pine Grove Cemetery. A third one is by the Congregational Church, commemorating the Revolutionary War soldiers who were also members of that congregation. And in the back of that church property is another marker to the Smith family that was also instrumental in the early days of this country when it was still colonial America. And finally, we put a marker up at the Mormon site, Joseph Smith Homestead, at 22 Boardman Lane with the approval of the owner. Since there are many Mormons who come to visit that site in Topsfield, and there was no marker, and several years ago we got in contact with the historical component of the Mormon church and split the cost on putting up a marker there. So this marker that we're talking about this morning is about the 6th one in that series, and it commemorates the fact that Topsfield at one time did have a railroad. It was chartered in 1851 by local merchants, and shares was sold in it to take care of the cost. And the local merchants felt that it would be an advantage to their businesses if the route that was proposed at the time, which went by Woods Pond, could be used to harvest ice, and they could see that as a lucrative business back in the 1850s. Unfortunately, after the shares were sold, the route was changed, much to the chagrin of the stockholders. But in any event, Georgetown had an interest in it. They were a big shoe manufacturing area, and they could ship their products and the raw materials in, their products out, much quicker than they could by wagon. So there were advantages all the way around. The people in Newburyport, over here, if you can see on the map, were upset over the Eastern Railroad and the charges that were being levied on them for shipping. They wanted an alternative route. So the so-called Danvers and Georgetown Railroad, which ran actually from Newburyport down through Byfield, over to Georgetown, going through Rowley, East Boxford, Ipswich, Topsfield, and then down to Danvers, and finally would connect with the Eastern Railroad. This would be an alternate route for them, and they really desperately wanted that. Well, we looked in when we heard about the rail trail going through Topsfield, under the guidance of Joe Geller, who's done a great job, incidentally, on putting that whole thing together. We got in touch with him and came up with the idea of putting a historical marker at some location along the trail to commemorate the rich history of the railroad. And at the same time, I looked through the Topsfield Historical Society's photograph file to see what pictures we might have, and we had very few. But thanks to Richard Sims and the Beverly Historical Society, which houses the Walker collection, transportation collection of pictures, there was a wealth of pictures over there having to do with Topsfield. So we went through there, made copies of them, and some of the more prominent ones are displayed here. The one that we did have in Topsfield by itself was this one, which shows the crossing of the railroad on Route 1. Hardly recognizable today. It's near the fairgrounds, and if you are heading north on Route 1, you might, with a little detective work, be able to see where the crossing took place. One of the pictures from the Walker collection is this one of a train pulling into the Topsfield station, the second station in Topsfield. The original one was near Cargill's insurance building at the corner of Grove Street and Main Street. But in any event, it was chartered in 1851 and ground was broken around 1853, April. And a number of Irish workmen were brought in specifically to construct the railroad. They were housed in the Grange building in downtown Topsfield, and they contributed heavily to the construction of the railroad. The first cars came into Topsfield in October of 1854. And for the next 100 or so years, the route was very busy with trains going to and from Newburyport into Boston. And we had business people, leisure riders, transportation being provided for goods and services. And it was a going railroad. It went through a succession of hands, finally winding up in charge by the Boston and Maine Railroad. And finally it gave up the ghost. I think the last train went through in about 1977, the last freight train. Excuse me. And in 1981, the MBTA formally abandoned the line. But in 2006, the Topsfield Board of Selectmen signed an agreement, a 99-year lease actually, with the MBTA for use of the railroad right away. And with that, construction of the, or approvals, I should say, began. That took longer than the construction itself. A number of approvals were needed and were gotten, again, under the guidance of Joe Geller. Did a great job in putting it all together. There was some opposition to it by some of the adjacent landowners who had actually been using some of the right-of-way for their own purposes. And they were a little reluctant to give that up, even though it wasn't part of their own property. But finally, approval was obtained. And I think if the history of other similar railroad right-of-ways can be considered as a forerunner of this one, those people will find it is advantageous to them to actually have an active rail trail running adjacent to their property. I mentioned the route here. I mentioned one of the early pictures of the railroad, excuse me, locomotive coming through. This picture at the bottom here, if you can see it, is of the second railroad station located on Park Street. And even though it's no longer there, the building next to it is still there and is recognizable. You can get a pretty good idea of where the station was by getting oriented to that building. And you can't see it, but over to the right of that building is where the St. Rose's Catholic Church now stands. And way in the background is one of the warehouses that the railroad used in Topsfield. That building is no longer there. Well, that's about a quick overview of the railroad history.